Hello, thank you so much for the invitation to present today. My name is Dr. Megan Saunders. I'm from CSIRO Oceans and Atmosphere based in Brisbane, Australia. Give me just a second and I'll get the slides set up on the screen. The title of my presentation today is Building the Evidence Base for Marine Ecological Restoration. A little bit about my background. I finished my PhD in biological oceanography, supervised by Anna Metaxas at Dal in 2010, where I focused on outbreak dynamics of an invasive species in kelp beds. After a few chilly winters there, I moved over to Perth to the University of Western Australia to take up an Endeavour postdoctoral fellowship with Anya Waite, who's now at Dal as well, to study Ningaloo Reef and the biological oceanography of the Western rock lobster. I later moved over to Brisbane, to the University of Queensland, where I spent 8 years or so doing spatial ecological modelling of coastal ecosystems, in particular looking at impacts of sea level rise on coasts. Last year, I took up a position at CSIRO Oceans Atmosphere, also in Brisbane, where my role is an ecological modeler. Now, if you haven't been here before, Brisbane is located partway up the coast of Queensland. It has a subtropical climate, so clear, beautiful winters and warm, hot, steamy summers. We have miles and miles of beautiful beaches. Brisbane itself, though, is on a river a little ways inland. So we have to go to a man-made beach instead if we want to be close to home. Sometimes I feel like I'm in a fairy tale or a Dr. Seuss book here with amazing plants and different colorful trees that in Canada would be house plants more than outside. But we also have a very extreme climate, prone to drought and floods. In fact, the day after I moved here, the largest flood in 40 years impacted Brisbane. So it was a strange start to living in a place where I was studying the impacts of rising sea levels. Now, my job now is at the CSIRO. This is Australia's national science agency, and our research focuses on the biggest challenges facing the nation, but with implications overseas as well. A few of CSIRO's achievements, you may have heard of Wi-Fi before. CSIRO's had a very strong role in understanding the science of bushfires, like the catastrophic ones we had last year. And CSIRO's very heavily involved in testing the vaccines for COVID-19. Within CSIRO, I'm within Oceans and Atmosphere, which you may liken to the US. And within that, the Coasts program, where we look at solutions for sustainable coastal development, future coastal blue industries, and coastal intelligence, so mapping, monitoring, modeling, etc. Now, my presentation today will look at building the evidence base for marine ecological restoration. The outline is here. I'll start with some background to ecological restoration, then tell you about some of the work I've done in structured decision support models in this field. Next, some of the synthesis research my team and I have done in restoration, and finish with a forward-looking perspective on bright spots in marine restoration. Now, throughout the talk, I'll be focusing on systems like mangroves, salt marshes, seagrass meadows, oyster reefs, coral reefs, and kelp beds. So primarily tropical and subtropical ecosystems, but you'll see a few familiar ones here with the kelp and seagrass. Now, coasts, of course, are under pressure by a huge number of threats occurring both in the water and from adjacent landscapes, including increasingly symptoms of global climate change. A decade or so, Ben Halpern and colleagues found that no area in the ocean is unaffected by human influence, and that a large fraction is strongly affected by multiple drivers. My research program has really been focusing a lot of these stressors and how we can mitigate them. I started becoming very interested in how coasts are impacted by activities occurring both on land and in the sea. Most coastal ecosystems face both of these threats. There's some key references listed here, but my research that I'll be presenting today started with these broad questions. What actions, conservation actions, should we take to conserve marine life, and where should those actions be taken? I'll be using the definition of ecological restoration provided by the Society for Ecological Restoration, which is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. You'll find lots of different definitions of restoration, afforestation, rehabilitation, etc., etc. And so there are some nuances, but the one I present here is the best kind of overview. On this figure, you'll see ecosystem condition on the x-axis from degraded to intact, and the degree of ecosystem function on the y-axis from non-functioning to fully functioning. And if you look at this graph from the right-hand side, you'll see that ecosystems that are pretty intact and functioning pretty well need a little bit of help. In terms of stressor mitigation, you might protect a salt marsh from grazing or mangroves from trampling, and you'll get improvement in the ecosystem condition and function. But once you pass these biotic and abiotic barriers, moving towards the left, you have to intervene in the system more and more. So have biological modification like planting, transplants, or abiotic physical chemical modification like reinstating hydrological flows for those systems to really kick back into intact and functioning conditions. In my own work, I coined the far right of this side passive restoration. So this, MPA, marine protected areas, is an example of this. You protect it from threats and the ecosystem improves. But as you move towards the left, you need increasingly active restoration. And this is the area I'll be focusing on in this presentation. Now, passive restoration can have huge benefits. Here's a great example I love from Chesapeake Bay, where mitigating or reducing the concentration of nutrients coming out of the watersheds by about a quarter resulted in an increase of 17,000 hectares in submerged aquatic vegetation. So that's very active restoration in the catchment, but passive from the marine perspective. Now, active marine restoration has not typically been viewed as a primary intervention strategy in marine systems. Here's an example from Australia, where Australia has one of the most expansive MPA networks in the world, shown in these colourful blocks. There's also been a large focus in mitigating land-based stressors, for instance, in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. And, active restoration in marine systems has been very, very minimal compared to these other approaches. But that's the tide really seems to be changing on that now, driven in large part due to the massive impacts we're starting to see in marine systems. Around the world, restoration is a fundamental element of multiple international agendas. So, for example, the Aichi biodiversity target included a target of restoring 15% of degraded ecosystems by 2020. That's currently under revision. Restoration's implicit or explicit in many of the Sustainable Development Goals. The next decade's been coined the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And the Paris Climate Agreement has restoration of ecosystems as one of the primary strategies for reducing CO2 emissions. But I think what you can take from this is that there's a pretty big bridge to span between current levels of implementation of restoration, particularly in marine environments, and these high-level agendas. And so my research has been, the broader view has been aiming to help fill some of this gap. So the first set of research I'll tell you about is based on structured decision support models. Well, what is this exactly? So in the field of conservation, over the past couple of decades, there's been a huge move towards making conservation or protection of intact habitats more systematic, more evidence-based, and more founded in cost effectiveness. So the idea of using models to get better outcomes for your efforts. I've been fortunate enough to work with people like Hugh Possingham, Kerry Wilson, and Mike Bode, who have been pioneering some of these areas. Hugh, Ian Ball, and Matt Watts in particular developed the software MarkSan, which you may have heard of, that is used to design networks of protected areas around the world. So this work I'm presenting now is really inspired by that field of science. in which we have a clear objective, a fixed budget, and a particular timeline. We then obtain data for the costs of particular conservation actions, the benefits that you can obtain from them, and the feasibility of that conservation action being achieving those benefits. And to do this, you need a reasonable model of the system. And this approach really hasn't been widely applied in marine restoration to date. So coming back to our conceptual model of a linked land sea system, acting in the marine environment, we may choose, if, let's say we want to maximize the area of the ecosystem that we're interested in, we might choose to protect it from direct damage like destructive fishing or anchoring. Or we could actually choose to restore the ecosystem directly by transplanting or applying seeds from other areas. So it's more of that marine gardening type approach, which hasn't been that commonly used. But thinking about our linked land sea system, we might also think about protecting adjacent landscapes from clearing. The clearing, of course, which causes the runoff of sediment, nutrients, and pesticides down into the ocean. Or actually of restoring already degraded catchments, or watersheds is another word you might use more commonly. So you can see it becomes a little bit complex in these linked land sea systems. So the work I'll be presenting was published a few years ago in PLOS Biology, also including Anna Metaxas, who was here on sabbatical, and acknowledging the other co-authors on this work. So if you do have more questions, do check out the paper, because I'll skim through a little bit in the presentation. So our study system was seagrass meadows. In our region was southeast Queensland. You'll see Brisbane in the slides, and offshore of Brisbane is Moreton Bay. It's an absolutely amazing marine area. It's home to threatened and endangered populations of dugongs and sea turtles. Really kind of in some parts of the bay relatively pristine, given that it's adjacent to Brisbane, which is a fairly large city. So our aims in this work were to estimate how sediment loads from catchments affect the area of a marine ecosystem. So what this means is with increased down from catchments, you get more turbid water, and with more turbid water, you reduce the area that's suitable for photosynthetic organisms like seagrass. And then we aim to quantify which of the 4 actions I outlined before maximizes the extent of seagrass after 30 years for a budget of 50 million per year. These were nominal, but this is how we described it in the work. And then finally, to examine how our decision making varies under different contexts. So the actions, I'll give you a little more info here. The first action was marine protection, which we parameterized at $130,000 or so a year. The feasibility of this is 100%. So if we put in these sustainable mooring devices, which protect seagrass from being scarred by anchors, it's 100% effective, with a time delay of, in this case, 0 years. Our next action was marine restoration, which we defined as transplanting plugs of seagrass from one area to another, with $400,000 or so per year cost, 38% feasibility, and a time delay of 3 years. These are the top 2 based on our own work, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and 3 years is a literature value. Our next action was land protection. So this is buying up intact vegetation along riparian areas on rivers, protecting it from further development. And our final action was land restoration. So going out there, stabilizing riverbanks and planting vegetation so that when flood events come through, the sediment isn't eroded and deposited into the bay. So I'll mention that southeast Queensland catchments are very highly modified, about 80% degraded. And so the runoff of sediment down into the bay is a very significant issue. So you know that the costs of acting on land are much cheaper than in the marine environment. But there's also a substantial time lag from when you restore land to when you see benefits downstream. We parameterize it conservatively at 10 years, but it could be 20 to 50 years. Our modeling approach was a dynamic landscape model, which was spatially implicit, so we use spatial data to parameterize it, but we don't represent spatial processes explicitly. And in this model, we describe the landscape as being either intact vegetation, which is protected, intact vegetation, which is available, so it's remnant vegetation, but not protected by any legislation, cleared vegetation, or cleared vegetation, which is in a restoring condition. We then link that landscape model down to the adjacent ocean through what I call the sediment link, which is in the middle there. And I'll tell you a little bit about this first. Basically, with increasing sediment, you get lower water clarity and therefore lower habitat availability in the seascape, which kind of changes the boundaries of that dashed line on the right. Anyway, the details aren't super important, but just to give you an idea of the overall structure of the model. Now, to do this, we needed to understand how much of the area might be suitable for seagrass that isn't already there. So where could we restore our seagrass? To do this, we used a published seagrass habitat distribution model, where we take presence and absence of seagrass from remote sensing imagery, data on water depth, data on Secchi depth to represent water clarity, which is sampled monthly at the points in the bay, and then we modeled it to get spatial layers indicated in the gradient of grey. And with these data, we could calculate the percent of surface light which is available on the seafloor. And we finally took some wave data. This is shown here, significant wave height, based on the SWAN model for Moreton Bay. And using these different data sets, built a model of seagrass presence or absence based on benthic, the percent of benthic light availability and wave height. So if you're interested in more, there's a few papers here that outline the method in more detail. But let's hone in on Secchi depth a little here. For the work I'm telling you about now, we needed a time series of Secchi depth and how it related to the sediment runoff from catchments. So for this, we took a time series of sediment runoff developed from the Source Catchments model, where you have suspended sediment on the y-axis and time on the x-axis over 12 or 13 years or so. You can see that there's strong interannual variability as well as strong seasonal variability. So for our models, we focused on wet season discharge, which is when most of the sediment comes out of the catchments during the large storms. We then ran that time series through the habitat distribution model I showed you before, and from this we're able to come up with what I call the sediment link. So on the y-axis is the area of habitat in a year that's considered suitable for seagrass, and on the x-axis is the sediment coming out of the catchment in tons. So on the far right, you'll see 2011, the year I moved to Brisbane, when there was large storm events, huge amounts of sediment delivered into the bay and lowered suitability for seagrass. And we did see that impact in terms of lost seagrass in the bay at that time. Importantly, this is based on temporal variability in runoff, which here we use as a proxy for variability in runoff caused by land uses. But there's a huge number of questions there, and will really just require a more well-funded project to answer. So some interesting future research. Coming back to our model, I've just described that sediment link in the middle. We then parameterized the land and seascape using numbers from spatial data and spatial layers to look at how much of the area is protected or intact or cleared, and then ran this dynamic model through time steps over 30 years, with our budget describing our budget and the parameters around budget describing how cleared landscapes could transition to protected landscapes through our actions of restoration or protection. So I'm just going to give you the main finding here. We found that despite high costs, active marine restoration can be the most cost-effective solution, in this case, maximizing the area of seagrass in our time frame. So this was a little bit surprising and a little bit counter to conventional wisdom on this topic. But really importantly, we found that the social environmental context influences our decision making. I'll give you a little example here. So for instance, our understanding of the rates of decline of the marine ecosystem, seagrass in this case, and also its ability to recover from disturbance, here a term expansion, were really strong factors affecting the outcomes of the model. So on the x-axis is the rate of decline in the ocean. So what are those local stressors that are impacting the seagrass meadows? And on the y-axis is the rate of expansion. Once the stressors have been mitigated, how fast can seagrass move into new areas? So as I alluded to before, we found that for what we felt at the time to best represent our system, restoring the ocean could provide the most cost-effective solution. But if we think that seagrass can respond a little bit faster as sediment is cleared out of the water, it actually switches our decision making to actively restoring the catchments. And this was great to see because there's been a lot of investment in this space in Southeast Queensland over the previous decades. But the conversation is very much now moving towards how active restoration can play a part in this landscape. And finally, if you have systems that are being very rapidly damaged by destructive activities, say by dredging, then you really do need to act to protect the ocean for the marine ecosystem for your most cost-effective solution. Now, from that model, some really interesting questions came about. I think that's one of the interesting things about developing models. Sometimes the process of structuring your thinking in that way leads to new projects. And that was certainly the case here. As you can see, we had we had about 32 parameters to describe in that model. And one of them was how much does marine restoration cost and how likely is it to succeed? Now, I really didn't realize I was opening quite a large can of worms with this question. I really thought we were going to come up with a number that was, plus or minus 30% and go from there. But the reality was a little bit different. And so I was lucky enough that Eliza Bayraktarov, who was a postdoc at UQ at the time, was happy to take on this challenge and really search through the literature and characterize what people had found and reported in terms of the cost, feasibility, duration, and area of restoration projects across 5 coastal ecosystems. So if you're interested in that, do check out the paper or data set, and we've since published a few follow-on papers to that project. Here's one example. This is restoration cost on the y-axis for 5 coastal ecosystems. And you can see that for all of the ecosystems, the costs range over up to about 7 orders of magnitude, with restoration costs even within one ecosystem ranging by about 4 orders of magnitude. So we were way off in terms of our preliminary assessment of what those costs might be. We also uncovered in this process that there's a lot of biases and inconsistencies in how cost data are reported, in part due to the kind of emergent nature of the field, but also a wide variety of ecological and social contexts under which restoration is accomplished, as well as the people, practitioners, governmental organizations, consulting agencies who are primarily tasked with doing large-scale restoration aren't strongly incentivized to publish those costs. So it's an area that we're working towards now. In any case, in addition to the fact that it's just quite a bit harder to work in marine environments compared to on land, we think that part of the low uptake of restoration is due to low confidence in outcomes. So our work supported this message that restoration projects accomplished to date had tended to be very small scale, like a football field in size or smaller, very expensive, and with low item-based success. But more recently, starting last year, when I started at CSIRO and some early workshops, we thought about this problem slightly differently. So if restoration is kind of a new and emerging field of research, relatively speaking, maybe that failures are common and we expect that. But the field is advancing, and what if instead of median values, we identify and we learn from successful outliers? And this thinking was supported recently by a paper led by Carlos Duarte called Rebuilding Marine Life, where they proposed that a forward-looking and positive view underpinned by evidence was required for us collectively to focus on rebuilding the oceans. So I'll be presenting some work now that I've led that's with a large number of colleagues currently in press in current biology. So you can look out for that at the end of December, called Bright Spots in Coastal Marine Ecosystem Restoration. In it, we focused on 6 ecosystems. From left to right, you'll see salt marsh, mangroves, seagrass, oysters, coral reefs, and kelp beds. Success is kind of quite a value-laden term and up for debate. So we focused this in on projects that were accomplished over very large scales for that ecosystem, projects that had evidence of persistence over long durations, projects that were cost effective compared to other projects for that ecosystem, and projects that provided social and economic benefits, or demonstrated social and economic benefits. So this is a review approach, and I'll give you some of the findings here. So for large scale, the typical restoration project is under a hectare, so around less than the size of a soccer field. But across the ecosystems, we found these bright spots where restoration has been accomplished over hundreds and thousands of hectares. And this was the case for 4 out of the 6 ecosystems. Here's an example. In Bangladesh, they've restored or reforested, which is planting in previously bare mudflats, 195,000 hectares of mangroves since the 1960s. So this really shows that when you have collective effort, multi-organization, multi-agency, people working together, including local community groups, you can achieve really large scales over a period of time. Now that's for mangroves. If you take the size of this box as the relative area of the largest mangrove project that's been successful, let's look at the size of the boxes compared to the other ecosystems. So salt marshes on the order of 4,000 or so hectares. Seagrass on the order of 1,700 hectares in Chesapeake Bay. The largest oyster restoration project is 130 or so hectares, also in the US. Kelp, about 70 hectares off the coast of California. And coral reefs, 2 hectares in Indonesia. So yeah, really big difference across the ecosystems. And what we're hoping is that the ecosystem on the right side, we can really start learning some of the approaches for the ecosystems that have been more successful over large areas. Now, for long duration, we found that projects, at least as they're reported in the literature, are typically about 1 to 2 years, which is the monitoring timeframe coinciding with grants and PhD projects, for example. But for all of the ecosystems, we found examples of the restoration projects persisting over 10 to 20 years, 10 to even 30 years. Here's an example of seagrass that was restored in the 1990s in Albany Harbour in Western Australia. A decade later, you can see those little patches have expanded and coalesced, and that project's still going, still successful to this date. Typical restoration projects are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per hectare, but we found examples across the 6 ecosystems where successful projects have been accomplished on the order of, for salt marshes and mangroves, hundreds of dollars per hectare, seagrasses and kelp on the order of 10,000 per hectare, and coral and oysters from about $50,000 to $70,000 per hectare. So, it can be done for less money. And we found examples of socioeconomic benefits of restoration from all of the ecosystems. Typically in the literature, people report ecological outcomes. About 70% of restoration projects only report, in the scientific literature, only report on ecological outcomes. But we found examples from all of the ecosystems where people were reporting increases in environmental awareness, increases in community engagement, increases in jobs, livelihoods, and the delivery of resources from restoration. And this is really, really important. because really restoration is a human endeavor. It's done for our own, motivations and objectives. And while, some people definitely have an intrinsic motivation to restore biodiversity, in many cases, people really want to be getting something out of that project, whether or not it's increased fishing or increased stability of the shoreline or increased creation of jobs. The jobs element being extremely important in the current economic crisis that we're in, where governments are really thinking about investing in green recovery. And if we find that if you invest in ecological restoration, it has about the same return on investment of, for instance, investing in the construction of roads. So really exciting area right now. Here's an example. This is oyster restoration of Half Moon Reef in Texas, done by the Nature Conservancy. They found that this project delivered 691,000 US to GDP through recreational fishing benefits, $1.27 million per year in general economic activity, people coming to fish, stay at hotels and eat at restaurants, for example, and the creation of 12 jobs. And 19 out of 20 of the fishermen surveyed reported increased satisfaction in fishing experience. So these are really great outcomes. Of the ecosystems we assessed, seagrass had kind of the weakest evidence behind it. So there's an interesting research area for someone. As I mentioned, it's actually 80% of projects that we surveyed in the literature only report ecological outcomes, and only 2% report economic, social, and ecological outcomes. So, hopefully we'll see that push a little in future. In this work, we looked back to the projects that we'd identified and said, well, what can we learn from these? And here's a few examples. I won't go through all of them, but here's a few to take home. Going right back to the beginning of the talk, when I talked about these different approaches to restoration, we found that mitigating multiple stressors using layered interventions was a feature in many projects. So, for example, to restore a kelp bed in California, it's really not enough to go out there and plant kelp. You might also have to be continuously culling the urchins that have been damaging the kelp bed. And we found this for coral reefs as well, in terms of grazing and predatory fish. Quite a few of the successful projects employed adaptation to provide additional rapid responses when required. So restoration really isn't a set and forget. It's kind of like taking care of your garden. You can plant it, but you have to keep going and make sure that it's tracking on the right trajectory over time. Here's an example from British Columbia, Canada, where salt marshes had been damaged through logging activities, and a legal mechanism triggered the requirement to restore salt marshes near Campbell River. What they found is after a little while, there started to be ponding on the salt marsh, which was damaging the plants. And some quick actions to rectify that then resumed the salt marsh on its recovery trajectory. A really exciting area of technological advancement in this field is the use of propagules. Here's an example from my colleague at CSIRO, Chris Doropoulos, and his colleagues, where they're working with Van Oord, which is the largest dredging company in the world, to go out on the Great Barrier Reef, way offshore, way farther than you would ever, be going out and transplanting corals. And they collect the spawn of the coral in those oil booms shown in yellow, bring the coral on board into the large tanks you can see in that image, let the embryos develop, and then these trials have been successful. The next stage will be seen if they can actually increase coverage of corals by releasing those embryos back into the water. So yeah, really exciting research going on there. Another amazing example comes from Robert Orth and colleagues in Virginia, USA. So this is an area where seagrass meadows had been damaged decades ago by wasting disease and other environmental events, and just never come back. So J.J. Orth and his colleagues started pioneering and developing these techniques to harvest the seeds from seagrass, which they then planted in little plots you can see on the top left there. And over a decade or so, the plants resulting from those seeds grew, and they expanded and they coalesced into the large dark patches you can see on the right. So to date, they've been successful in restoring several thousand hectares of seagrass at these sites. So super exciting stuff, and really only made it possible by these advances in using propagules. Another key feature in successful projects is partnerships. So restorations, it's a human action. It involves local people, the private sector, like Mars company is really interested in coral restoration. Scientists, government agencies, non-government agencies, should mention it here, Indigenous groups. So yeah, partnerships, super important. And of that, strong local involvement and support from the local community. And I'll confess, I was really surprised when I started learning about this, but now I can say with confidence, this is really key. A great example comes from the Makoko Pamoja project in Gaziquel County, Kenya. And this is where a mangrove restoration project was strongly designed and implemented with the local community. And then the carbon credits sold by the planting of those mangroves, which are then sequestering carbon down into the seafloor sediments. The payments for ecosystem services from those carbon credits then go back to the local community to support schools and hospitals. It's a really, really nice example there, and it'd be great to see that replicated in other places. So I'll finish up here. I'd say marine restoration is a really rapidly expanding field. There's opportunities to apply approaches from other fields. Like I mentioned, decision support is pretty nascent, at least over large scales in this project or in this field, and can be used to help scale up restoration as we move into the UN decade on restoration. I propose that focusing on successful outliers is a forward-looking approach that can help us aspire towards bigger, better, newer things, and also serves as a kind of a positive message counter to some of the negative messaging that we hear around the marine environment these days, and which may be counter to people taking productive action. So we believe that marine restoration will become a primary tool in the conservation toolbox in future to help achieve social, economic, and environmental objectives. I'd like to finish up by acknowledging the different organizations and funding which have contributed towards my research in this area, and in particular, a huge number of collaborators, students, and team members who have helped contribute to my thinking and work in this area. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer emails or get in touch on Twitter. And if there is enough interest, perhaps we could arrange an online meeting at an hour slightly more amenable to our respective time zones. Thank you very much.